Now available in paperback and e-readers, Isis, All About the Goddess. The Goddess Next Door bears all in the art studio to catch a campus stalker in this action-packed Isis series mystery. Get your copy of Isis, All About the Goddess in paperback and e-readers at online booksellers everywhere. Historical Women in Crisis. One of my viewers wanted me to do another installment in the Historical Women in Crisis series. And for this installment in the Historical Women in Crisis series, I'm going to be talking about Spanish activist and feminist Aurora Rodriguez Carballeira and her daughter Hildegart Rodriguez Carballeira. Now, the first person I'm going to be talking about in this Historical Women in Crisis video is Aurora Rodriguez Carballeira. Now, Aurora Rodriguez Carballeira was a Spanish political activist and women's rights activist who wanted to socially engineer her daughter into becoming the perfect feminist. And when her plans to make her daughter Hildegart Rodriguez Carballeira into the perfect feminist failed in her eyes, she wound up shooting her 18-year-old daughter dead and winding up being tried for murder and institutionalized for the rest of her life. Now, Aurora Rodriguez Carballeira basically wound up on the road to becoming a woman in crisis, not when she wound up taking the life of her daughter, but the time that she was born, and born into a home with two extremely intellectualized parents who had no real connection to humanity and no real concern to show love to their daughter. Now, Aurora Rodriguez Carballeira was born in 1879 in her family home on Magdalena Street in Ferrol, a Coraluna, Spain, and her parents were both people who were extremely upper class. Unfortunately, this upper class family, while they had lots of money, did not have any sort of love, and because they were intellectuals, they did not know how to meet the emotional needs of Aurora Rodriguez Carballeira. And since they didn't know how to meet the emotional needs of Aurora Rodriguez Carballeira, they basically looked to not raise their daughter to be socialized in an environment where she could learn how to be around other people. No, they basically isolated their daughter, and as they isolated their daughter, she didn't get a formal education. No, she became self-taught on subjects, and that's a very dangerous thing, because when people start to become too self-taught and they don't have anybody to present a counterpoint or a differing opinion to them, what happens to little children is they basically start entering into a rose-colored reality where everything looks and seems like our world, but the whole thing is everything is completely distorted by their imagination. And with no parents to nurture this girl and meet her emotional needs and teach her how things work in the real world, what happened with Aurora Rodriguez Carballeira is she wound up inside of an echo chamber, and inside of that echo chamber, the only person she could hear as she read all of the books in her father's library of books regarding liberalism, progressivism, utopian socialism. She didn't really have anybody there to show her how this worked in the real world, and this basically wound up twisting her whole perception of reality. And as it twisted her whole perception of reality, this is where she wound up becoming a person just caught up in her own ideas without ever having any of those ideas challenged in the real world. Now, what further exacerbated this situation with Aurora Rodriguez Carballeira is that her sister Josefa had a son, Pepito Areola, and she left him in the care of Aurora. And as she was left in the care of Aurora at 16 years old, she educated the boy until he became a child prodigy. And I believe this is what wound up gassing up Aurora's head. And as her head got gassed up, what happened was she wound up thinking that she was greater than what she was, and this basically gave her a god complex. And as this boy wound up becoming a successful musician, this basically made Aurora believe that she was some sort of god in her own eyes, and as she started to think about her own reformist and eugenic ideas as related to her plans for women's rights, This is where Aurora decided to go from living in that rose-colored reality to entering a place I call the secret world. And in that place of the secret world, this is where she sought to express her natural femininity and natural sexuality, but did so in a very disturbing and deviant fashion, which basically showed how she had become more and more disconnected from real people and disconnected from real life. And as she became more disconnected and detached from real people and real life, she came up with the idea of using her own body as part of a eugenics experiment of looking to raise a woman in optimal conditions to be able to see how her ideas regarding making women perfect would come out, and basically look to again participate in this experiment and look to find a father who could not claim paternity of the baby. Now, this just showed how deeply disconnected and detached Aurora Rodriguez Calibria was from reality, and how she was just completely detached to the point where she didn't even think to meet her own emotional needs as related to a relationship with a person, and didn't look to share any love with a person because she never had any love shared with her by her parents. And because she never was taught how to love anyone or care about anyone, she didn't see her people as people. No, she saw people as objects as related to her experiment, and saw her own body as an object to use in this experiment, saw everything as part of a way to be part of her experiment, and did not see any sort of anything as related to emotion as related to this relationship. And as she looked for this father, she looked for a man that could not claim paternity for the baby, and basically started a paradigm that many feminists wound up following in as related to their whole concept of you don't need a father to raise a child. This is the whole mindset that Aurora Rodriguez Calibria basically had. And as she had that plan, she wanted to raise this child without a father so that there would be nobody to push back on her ideas. Moreover, there wouldn't be anybody to present a differing or dissenting opinion or care for their own child. This would be a way for her to maintain her power as a god over her own child, and that child would never learn anything about love or care and would just be an object again to her, an object she would look to socially engineer into the perfect person, ironically, the perfect person raised by an imperfect person who was created by God, who was born in sin, and now looking to participate in the sinful behavior of fornication to create an illegitimate child who she wanted to believe was going to be absolutely perfect. Now, this logic makes only sense to Aurora Rodriguez Calibria, who many people would say was Arkham certified, but a Lieda military priest, Alberto Baez, decided to go out here and look to score some easy draws back then, and looked for her to drop the skid mark bloomers, and looked for him to get a taste of the atomic waste from the special place, and had 3 sexual encounters with Aurora Rodriguez Calibria as a psychological collaborator, but really he was just a guy looking to, again, look to get some easy sex and be able to cover it up to make his world smooth, because according to his religion, he was not supposed to be participating in sex, but he did so anyway because he wanted to, again, get this easy sex, and Aurora basically wanted to go out here and get the seed so that she could go out here and have this child. And after she was certain that she was pregnant, she moved to Madrid to give her daughter the life she had prepared for her as related to her experiment. And sadly, what happened with this experiment is it wound up falling completely apart, and it wound up falling completely apart because Aurora Rodriguez Calibria found out what happens with many black women and single mothers find out, is that when you raise your child on your own, you can't really raise a child on your own. Yes, things will go well as related to your plans when the child is very small, and Aurora wound up making her daughter meet her expectations, and her daughter Hildegart became a bit of an international celebrity as related to being this socially engineered perfect prodigy child. Unfortunately, what happened with this child is that this child, as she started to grow up and started to enter into adolescence, this is where Aurora Rodriguez Calibria started to have issues, because when this child started to become an adolescent, this is where her smooth world wound up falling completely apart, and her smooth world wound up falling completely apart because her child started to express different political positions and started to look to launch a plan to become independent from her mother. This is just natural, healthy behavior for any child during adolescence. And the great irony here is that even though Aurora Rodriguez Calibria read a lot of books in her father's library, sadly, she didn't read or comprehend the one that talked about children in adolescence, because children in adolescence, when they do what's natural, is go out here and look to rebel, look to push back against the boundaries established by their parents, look to challenge the ideas of their parents, and challenge the ideals that their parents have taught them. This is what children naturally do as they look to go out here and be independent people. And what happened with Aurora Rodriguez Calibria is what she wanted to do was continue maintaining the codependent relationship that she established with her child, established this codependent relationship with her child that she hoped to maintain. Unfortunately, as the child looked to go out here and separate herself and become her own woman, ironically, this is where the perfect woman that Aurora Rodriguez Calibria made in her daughter, Hildegart, started to become flawed, and became flawed because she just wanted to be an independent person, which is what every adolescent wants to do. And this is where Aurora Rodriguez Calibria, who many say had paranoid delusions about an international conspiracy to ruin her perfect eugenic experiment, looked to murder her daughter, but there was no conspiracy to ruin her perfect child. Her child was basically participating in natural human behavior that every human being does. But sadly, that didn't stop Aurora Rodriguez Calibria from looking to murder her daughter while she was asleep, and wanted to explain that the sculptor, after discovering the most minimal imperfection in his work, destroys it, and just shows how twisted that Aurora Rodriguez Calibria was, because what was happening here was that this woman, as she was in the secret world, basically got upset because she had to deal with the reality that this child was their own human being. Yes, this child was born as related to being born from this woman, but she was eventually going to be her own woman, and this is what she didn't like, and that's what destroyed her idea of the perfect feminist, the whole idea that this woman had a differing opinion, which also is ironic. Here is a woman looking to make a perfect woman, but the whole thing is that as she looked to make this person perfect, this person wanted to be their own person, so she thought murdering this person would stop this person from being a flaw. But the whole thing is that human beings are human beings, and no human being is perfect. No, all human beings basically are born in sin due to the fall of Adam and Eve. And sadly, Aurora Rodriguez Calibria never was taught about the Bible. Out of all the books she read, she never read the Bible. And had she read the Bible, she would have basically understood there was no perfect person ever born outside of Jesus Christ, and no other person was born perfect outside of Jesus. So you cannot go out here and make a perfect person, not a perfect feminist, because a feminist is, again, a social construct that is meant to try to upend God's order. And the quest to make this girl into a woman who would upend God's order was destined to fail because, again, a woman was designed to be a helpmeet to a man, designed to serve a man. And when a woman tries to go out here and make a woman to serve herself, basically what happens is, what happened with Aurora Rodriguez Calibria is that her natural female jealousy took place. And again, female jealousy because she didn't want to compete against her daughter. And that's what happens with many single mothers. They don't want to compete against their daughters, so they go out here looking to destroy their daughters. And they look to destroy their daughters because they don't want the daughter to do better than them. That's what basically happened here. And that's another ironic thing, in that she was looking to make the perfect woman, but the whole thing is female nature came in. Female nature came in and led to her taking the life of her daughter in this eugenics experiment, and it basically led to the complete fall of this whole matriarchal social engineering plan, because after Aurora wound up murdering her daughter Hildegart and said that she would do it again, she wound up making a situation where she wound up getting sentenced to 26 years in prison, and wound up living in a psychiatric asylum until she wound up dying of cancer in 1955, and was buried in a mass grave in an ignominious fashion. I mean, what happened to Aurora Rodriguez Calibria is that this woman basically looked to make the perfect woman, but then wound up becoming a woman in crisis who ended in a way just as bad as Jezebel. Now, the second person I am going to be talking about in this historical women in crisis video is Aurora Rodriguez Carballeira's daughter, Hildegart Rodriguez Carballeira. Now, Hildegart Rodriguez Carballeira was the daughter of Aurora Rodriguez Carballeira, and she was raised from birth to become the perfect feminist, and the perfect feminist to go out here and represent the perfect idea of feminist ideals. And when she didn't meet those unrealistic standards established by her mother, this is where her mother wound up taking her life at 18 years old. Now, Hildegart Rodriguez Carballeira basically wound up on the road to becoming a woman in crisis ever since she was basically an idea in her mother's head. Because it was her mother who basically put her on the road to being a woman in crisis in an effort to socially engineer her into becoming the perfect feminist. And this whole idea of making her into a perfect feminist was what led to her becoming one of the first feminist indoctrinated women in history. Now, this Hildegart Rodriguez Carballeira basically was put on this road to being this woman in crisis due to the way she was conceived, because Aurora Rodriguez Carballeira did not see her daughter as a person. No, she saw her daughter as an experiment, and as she saw her daughter as an experiment, she did not want a biological father in her life, because that wouldn't fit within her eugenic intentions to make this perfect child to further her feminist and socialist ideology. So what was really ironic is she chose a priest to be out here and be the father to her child, and to make this woman of the future. And that priest basically again looked to be able to avoid getting involved with her. So this was a way he could go out here and be able to control. She could be able to control the child, and the father not be in the child's life. Now, as Hildegart Rodriguez Carballeira was being raised, she was not being raised with any sort of love or care or nurturing by her mother. No, her mother basically was living in a rose-colored reality, and as she lived in this rose-colored reality in the secret world, she did not see Hildegart as a person. No, she saw her as an object, and she saw her as an object that she could go out here and make into a perfect person. Basically, didn't see her as a human being that deserved to be loved or cared for. No, this child was supposed to be a representation of her. And when I look at Hildegart Rodriguez Carballeira and her relationship with her mother, it really reminds me a lot of the relationship that many women in the black community have with their single mothers. And that whole relationship with their mothers is one where the woman has these ideals of pride based on her feelings, where she thinks she's going to go out here and raise her children to be better than her, all on her own, and think that she does not need a man. And what she wants to do as the strong, independent black woman is look to raise this child without a father, and in order to spite the things that are presented as related to family, and basically look to spite God in some ways. And as they look to become the God of their children, they think they can raise their children to be perfect on their own. But what happens is, the great irony is that the children wind up becoming flawed, all due to them being raised by this mother, who is the first teacher, who refuses to acknowledge their own flaws and refuses to acknowledge their own sin. Now, the big problem with Aurora Rodriguez Carballeira's whole theory as related to going out here and raising the perfect feminist is that she walked away from God, because in all of her intellectualism, she didn't want to believe God, and she thought she could raise this child on her own and without a father, not understanding that children come from the Father and are a blessing from the Father in heaven. And the whole thing is that children are supposed to be raised by two parents, but Aurora Rodriguez Carballeira basically thought she could raise her daughter on her own, and thought she could go out here, and because she raised her sister's son into becoming a child prodigy, she could raise her own daughter to become even better than he was. And what she sought to do was go out here and raise Hildegart to become this intellectualized child. But sadly, what happened was, because that child never got any love and was basically seen as an object, what happened with Hildegart was, yes, she was very intelligent and knew how to read at 2, wrote her first letter at 3, was able to type before age 4, spoke multiple languages by the age of 5, and by 11 years old was giving conferences on feminism and female sexuality. I mean, I found that to be just quite troubling because the child doesn't even know anything about their own body, and they're talking about sex and feminism. Again, just basically parroting what their mother has said, but because they don't have any ability to form ideas on their own. And her mother was basically had a strict control over Hildegart because Hildegart wasn't a person. She was an object, and she was a part of her experiment to make her into a perfect person. And as this perfect person started to enter into the real world, this is where Hildegart started having problems. Because at 13 years old, she entered the School of Law and Commerce in Madrid and got a law degree at 17. And as she started to enter the real world, this is where she started to have real problems because she hadn't been socialized properly. Yes, she was an international darling as related to her intelligence, but her social skills were basically garbage because she hadn't been nurtured by people, hadn't been cared for as a person, not seen as a person at all. She was just an object to parrot information. And as she was out here talking about socialism, feminism, and women's rights and sexual liberation, she talked about concepts far beyond herself. And as she talked about these concepts far beyond herself as related to this egalitarian ideals that her mother had, what she did was go out here and again talked about a whole lot of different things as related to sexual revolution, and basically reminded me, as I listened to her, as reading her story, talking about sex reformation and prostitution and eugenics, and talking about destroying the patriarchy. Again, this stuff, basically she was sounding a lot like a social justice warrior, as I read about her. And again, as I was reading about this, about Hildegart Carballeira, basically she sounded so much like a social justice warrior that it just basically made me look at her and go, this is basically, she was basically an SJW of the time, who was raised by her single mother to be this perfect person, but this perfect person was just somebody going out here parroting a lot of flawed ideals. And as she parroted a lot of these flawed ideals, and these ideals started coming out, this is where she wound up in a place where her mother, basically, her ideas were not going like she expected, because as she was going out here, getting more and more freedom to express herself, this is where Aurora Rodriguez Carballeira started to get very angry because the experiment wasn't going the way she was expecting. She wasn't going the way she was expecting, and the child was not going out here being the person that she expected her to be. And that was just part of life, because in adolescence, children start to go out on their own. This is where they started to have friction between Aurora Rodriguez Carballeira and Hildegart Rodriguez Carballeira. They started to have friction because the daughter started to have her own opinions, her own ideas, and her own frame of thinking, and wanted to become more and more independent of her mother. And as she looked to go out here and become more and more independent of her mother, who wanted to maintain an emotional hose to her in an effort to maintain a codependent relationship with her, this is where the friction between the two started to escalate. And this is where Aurora Rodriguez Carballeira basically started to become jealous of her daughter, because she was becoming her own person, started expressing her own ideas, and started going out here and started presenting her own talking points and her own plans. And this is where Aurora Rodriguez Carballeira's smooth world was starting to become rough. And as it became rough, she started to simmer and boil in anger, and then eventually wound up exploding in a rage, where she wound up murdering her child and taking her child's life, all because she couldn't deal with the idea of her daughter not being perfect. And the idea of perfect is not about this child being a perfect person, but being a person who basically would just agree with her and fit her ideas into her ideas and make her world smooth. And when the daughter went out here and looked to again create her own place in the world, this is where Aurora Rodriguez Carballeira started to lose it, because what she didn't want was a person who would go out here and be able to share love with others. All she wanted to do was create this intellectualized perfect person, but no person is perfect outside of Jesus Christ. No, Jesus is the only person born without sin, and the only person who is perfect. And Aurora Rodriguez Carballeira's plans were just destined to fail from minute one. They were destined to fail because no person is perfect, no person can be made perfect, and no social engineering campaign by something like feminism can make a woman perfect, because a woman comes from a man, and again, since she comes from a man, and both of them were a part of the fall with Adam and Eve, and people are born in sin, there is no way to make a person perfect. But that didn't stop Aurora Rodriguez Carballeira from coming up with this plan to again put her daughter on this road to hell with her good intentions. Put her daughter on a road to hell with her so-called good intentions, which were really about her being just completely disconnected from reality. Because again, no person can be perfect. No person can be perfect in this world. But it didn't stop her from coming up with this plan, a plan that led to this girl going from being a little girl who was on the road to growing up to become a woman in crisis. Now, if you want to learn more about what leads to women winding up becoming socially engineered to become feminists like this and wind up on a road where this leads to them becoming women in crisis, you can pick up my book, The Woman Crisis, on Amazon.com in paperback and Kindle format. You can also find The Woman Crisis at other online bookstores like Draft the Digital, Google Play, Barnes & Noble, and big box retailers like Walmart and Target. This was a video requested by one of my viewers, and if you want to request a video, you can drop a donation for a minimum of $15 to the PayPal or the Cash App by clicking the links in the description box. That's all I have to say for this video. You can comment, rate, and subscribe. Now available in paperback. From the author of the critically acclaimed book, The Man Crisis, comes The Woman Crisis. Learn why so many women have become lost in their quest to have it all in The Woman Crisis. Get your copy of The Woman Crisis in paperback at Amazon.com and online booksellers today. Support Black-owned and Black-operated digital broadcast media. www.niceradionetwork.com. Nice Radio Network, broadcasting 24 hours a day, 7 days a week.